I thought the chapter on Downing Street was one of the most fascinating in the book, and I was really amused to hear that it had been put up more or less as a bit of opportunistic property speculation. Jerry-built, I think is how you describe it. And by the 1960s, it was in danger of basically crumbling away.
George Downing clearly saw the advantage of obtaining a lease on the land when he was working in the cockpit offices as the Spymaster General for Cromwell. And Cromwell more or less allowed him the lease on the land, but it was nearly 30 years before he finally got his hands on it. When he did so, in about 1680, he built a small cul-de-sac of very jerry-built houses. They were jerry-built because it was very boggy land, very marshy, and the foundations were based on a sort of raft of timbers that obviously eventually deteriorated and collapsed. As a result, the houses started shifting. Certainly by the 1960s, and there had been earlier restoration work on them, by the 1960s they were in such a dangerous condition that a carpenter had to be kept in Downing Street just to ease open the windows every now and then and do running repairs on the buildings. They were completely gutted, but restored to the Georgian magnificence. And those are largely the rooms that we see today. Walpole was the first Prime Minister to occupy the building. He was granted the lease on the number 10 Downing Street, which was then numbered number 5 Downing Street, but he turned it down, and he was very wealthy anyway, and he said that he would only take it as long as it was held in perpetuity for future prime ministers, although at that time the chief minister was known as the First Lord of the Treasury, and that's why that title appears on the letterbox of number 10 even to this day. But having been given a free building to live in, which was convenient for the House of Commons, he wasn't satisfied with the accommodation, and he got his own architect to knock together a very large house at the back of number 10 with the number 10 building. The curious thing is that he had the opportunity to have the entrance onto Horse Guards. It would have provided a very grand entrance to a very fine house, but instead he chose the rather pokey entrance to number 10. It means that today you go into the front door of number 10 and it's like a TARDIS. You can walk inside number 10, through number 11, all the way to number 12, the house at the end. And you don't realise it, but when you walk directly through that famous door and keep going, the cabinet doors face you, and then there's the spiral staircase, the famous staircase up to the first floor, where the official rooms are. The Prime Ministers do tend, particularly these days, to find that the space inside number 10 is not entirely adequate for running a modern government. It's not like the White House, it's not like the West Wing, and it's not like the Kremlin. It's just not big enough. As a result, Gordon Brown has very secretively expanded his empire into the Cabinet Office, which has been turned in all but name into the office of the Prime Minister. And he now has a war room in number 12, which is where the chief whips used to occupy, and after the Tories lost office, Alistair Campbell took it over, and that's where the press officers had their offices.
Before we leave Downing Street, I just wanted to ask you about the famous door, because the door is not what it appears to be.
No, after the IRA attempted to assassinate the cabinet while they were having a war cabinet under John Major, the House was very badly shaken, as were the cabinet ministers. Douglas Hurd came out with a wonderful quote about being under the table and not being quite sure what Englishmen should do when being mortared and lying underneath the cabinet table. John Major suggested to them, "I think we should carry on somewhere else." And they dusted themselves down and went off to the Admiralty building. The house itself was very badly shaken up, and repairs had to be carried out. Secretly, all the windows were made blast-proof. The whole building was made blast-proof, but the door itself, which actually shook with the explosion which was in the back garden, was replaced with a blast-proof door. It used to be wooden. The original is now in the Churchill Museum in the Cabinet War Rooms, but the new one is more or less solid steel. It's so heavy that it takes 8 men to lift it off its hinges, and it is quite secretly taken away every now and then, every few months, to be buffed up. There are 2 front doors to number 10.
I wanted to ask you finally, Colin, if there was one discovery that you made in the research of this book that really stood out for you, whether it was a view or a place that you hadn't been before, or some anecdote that really captured your imagination.
I think that the best example I came across of how a journalist can bring a different view to a book of history that historians have somewhat missed was in the Admiralty, where I discovered that Nelson had had dinner with his wife Fanny in 1798 in the grand dining room there, which is used today. And Fanny had been all attentive to her husband. Because he'd already lost one arm, he required his food to be cut up, and she actually shelled nuts for him. The love he showed to his wife was remarked upon and was written up in her diary. 2 years later, in 1800, he returned for dinner with his wife Fanny, and I discovered that his attitude towards his wife had completely changed. He now treated her with absolute contempt. This was after the Battle of the Nile. He'd been to Naples after the battle, a hero, and had fallen straight into the arms of Emma Hamilton. He'd come back to London. Emma was pregnant, it's supposed, with his child, and he treated his own wife so badly that it's said that she got up from the table and ran out crying, and she had to explain to the wife of the First Sea Lord the conditions in which she was living, and it was not very long after that that Nelson and his wife parted, and he went to live with Emma in a strange ménage à trois with her husband. I think that by isolating those 2 visits to the dining room, you saw a very different side of Nelson the hero. You saw the human side of it, flaws, warts and all. And I thought that was stunning. And there was a footnote to that story as well, because it was in the same room that John Prescott was photographed holding his diary secretary in his arms, which led to his own eventual resignation. I think there's nothing new, and certainly if you look back at Wolsey's life, you could say that Wolsey could teach our current crop of politicians something about how to milk the system. It's said that he was worth £11 billion, which is more than Abramovich, and he earned from the church and the state, even in those days, in Tudor coinage, £33,000 a year. Wolsey's riches were so great that even Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were astonished by the gold plate, silver plate, and the fabrics that he left behind when they went to inspect the palace after he'd been forced out.